Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Podcast. My name is Jasper and I'm the editor of the magazine. Joining me today are Murray Dahm, Marc DeSantis, Marc McCaffery and Lindsay Powell. Hi guys. Angus Wallace of the History Network is still our technical wizard, but as of tonight I'll act as master of ceremonies. Today we're going to discuss one of the first issues of the magazine, issue 1.4, which deals with the Roman conquest of Spain. The thing is, we actually did this podcast already once, 7 years ago. So somebody was not paying attention while we were preparing for this. Nevertheless, we have some good questions from our mostly patrons, I think. And we can go over them and see what we can discuss. And maybe we'll go off the rails here and there and hopefully have some other things to talk about. Marc DeSantis, I believe that you had some notes prepared about the start of how Rome got involved, and that ties in pretty well with Brian's question.
Right. The advent of Roman power in Spain comes as a result of its need to defeat the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War. If we go back a little to the 230s, in 237, Carthage is reeling from its defeat not only in the First Punic War, which left it saddled with a massive indemnity to pay to the victorious Romans, but it also suffered heavily as a result of the so-called mercenary revolt, which it fought against its own mercenary soldiers between 240 and 238. There were two factors driving Hamilcar Barca's move to Spain in 237. He leads an expeditionary army there to the south of Spain, and that is, it's the need to obtain money to pay off the indemnity, but also it seems very clear that Hamilcar Barca was already looking forward to a second war against the Romans. And in Spain, not only would he be able to find the silver that Carthage would need to pay off its debts, but also he could recruit its army, soldiers for his army that would then be used against the Romans. So Spain as a nation, and I'm talking right now the Iberian Peninsula, roughly south of the Tagus River, that was where he would recruit his soldiers. It was where he had his silver mines, and it was a remarkably successful economic endeavor. That is, annually, the Carthaginian mines were producing some 2,000 to 3,000 talents of silver, which was an enormous sum. A talent was roughly 57 pounds of silver metal. So you can imagine that they were making a lot of money, and Spain became an economic production center for the Carthaginian Empire. He dies, Hamilcar Barca dies in 228. He's betrayed by a local Spanish chieftain who had initially been friendly but then had attacked him. Hamilcar saves Hannibal and his son Hasdrubal Barca, but dies in trying to lead off the pursuing Spanish troops that are chasing after him. It falls to Hannibal to then use Spain as the base from which to lead his army into Italy in 218. Problematically for Hannibal, the conquest of Spain was never fully completed. That is, the parts of Spain, especially southern Spain, was under Carthaginian control and very solid. But what had happened was that there were still parts of it that were not under true Carthaginian domination, despite the presence there of three armies, one that he left under his brother Hasdrubal Barca, another that he left under Hasdrubal Gisgo, and a third under Mago Barca, his youngest brother. The Romans showed keen strategic sense in sending an army in 218 BC to contest control of Spain, even while Hannibal was making his own way on his invasion to Italy. And what the Roman presence did under the Scipio brothers, that's Publius Cornelius Scipio and Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio, did was that by defeating the Carthaginian Carthaginians that they found there, especially in 215 at the Battle of Ibera, which is also known as the Battle of Dertosa, they prevented the immediate and timely reinforcement of Hannibal in Italy after the Battle of Cannae. What this meant is that Hannibal was on his own, and the Romans managed to tie down most of the Carthaginian forces that were available to Carthage in Spain, defending what was, arguably speaking, the most valuable province that they had. Unfortunately for the Scipio brothers, Publius and Gnaeus Scipio, they both perish in a pair of battles. They divide their forces and are betrayed by Celtiberian allies, and they're defeated at the battles of Castulo and Illorca. Publius Cornelius Scipio's son, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who's later given the surname of Africanus, he's 25 years old, and he takes over command of the Roman war effort in Spain. No one else wants this job. He goes there. He's got relatively few forces, but when he's there, and one of his first moves in 209 BC was in a coup de main, a lightning strike. He captures the city of New Carthage. It's the modern Cartagena, and it's been lightly garrisoned with only about 1,000 Carthaginian troops, left woefully undefended. And at a stroke, he seizes Carthage's main base in the Iberian Peninsula. So not only does he get all sorts of equipment, he steals the treasury, he gets siege engines, he takes many thousands of captives. But this, what should have been was the primary base and for the Carthaginian war effort, now is in Roman hands. He makes friends with, through a policy of clemency and also just a shrewd political instinct, he makes friends with many Spanish chieftains who come over to him as he starts to win. They start seeing that the Romans are, have the upper hand, and they ally himself with the young Scipio. Scipio manages to defeat both the Hasdrubal Barca in a battle at the Baecula in 208 BC, I want to say, and what happens is that he's able to prevent, for a relatively long time, he's able to prevent any sort of reinforcement of Hannibal in Italy. Hasdrubal does eventually escape. He leaves in 208 BC and then goes to Italy, where he's defeated at the Metaurus River in 207, but the delay severely hampers any sort of augmentation of Hannibal's troops in the south of Italy. In 206 BC, Scipio manages to defeat the largest Carthaginian army under Hasdrubal Gisgo at the Battle of Ilipa. And what he demonstrates at Ilipa was a very sure handling of the Roman army. He exploits the inner subdivisions of the Roman legion, made it possible for him to extend his wings and surround Carthaginian forces at the Battle of Ilipa. That's the last major strike against the Carthaginian presence in Spain. Mago himself would abandon Spain in 205 BC to open up a new front in Liguria. But apart from leaving Spain to the Romans and the devastating consequences of losing Spain to Carthage, is that Scipio was able to develop his own tactical skill and train his troops for the eventual fight that they would have in North Africa against Hannibal at Zama. So the war in Spain had the dual effect of depriving Carthage of its recruiting grounds, of the place where it sourced most of its silver from, but also it made the Roman army a lot better, and especially it brought Scipio to the fore, one of the few generals who could actually go toe-to-toe with Hannibal.
So before we go on and see what made the Romans continue their conquest in Spain, can we say anything about what the Carthaginians, found in Spain and how they might have left it?
Again, we have the problem that the Carthaginian sources for it don't exist. We only have the Roman sources for it, and so we find that the Carthaginians were able to recoup their losses from the first Punic War, and create an empire in Spain with new cities being founded there, and make immense amounts of money from the silver mines very, very quickly. This crippling indemnity they had to pay after the end of the First Punic War was paid off ahead of schedule because of the wealth that the Carthaginians found. And I think that, other than some vague aspects of the Roman attitude to the Treaty of the Ebro, that you can't, the Carthaginians are not allowed to come north of the Ebro, that doesn't restrict the Romans from interfering south, as all Roman treaties do. They tell you what you can't do, not what we can't do. But I think that's pretty much it. We know that the Carthaginians moved in. We know that they found these new cities, Cartago Novo and others, and there's very little solid to go on. We know from the various tribes that ally and revolt that obviously that conquest wasn't complete, but it was complete enough for Hannibal to use it as a launching pad for his invasion in 218. But
we have got the fact that I think the Carthaginians are in Spain a little bit really before we really know it, because if you look at the First Punic War, they've already got those Iberian mercenaries operating in their army. You get the references that I'm particularly thinking the Siege of Agrigento. And so they're already pulling resources out of the Iberian Peninsula, and I think it's also the Barca family seem to be taking the initiative after the First Punic War in actually leading the charge towards Iberia. So I think there's already a decent Carthaginian presence over there. It's just that we don't have the details, but we have these little inklings of it.
Well, I think from an earlier age, we of course have all there's a Phoenician aspect to Spain, which is a launching pad for any expedition beyond the gates of Heracles, the Pillars of Heracles. So
you've got the city of Gades as being founded by the Carthaginians, of course.
So we can see connections. How Phoenician you regard Carthage as, and there's Phoenician trading ports all along the coast there. So there's a foothold already, and again, mercenary recruitment implies relationships and organization.
I believe that the Carthaginian presence was limited mainly to trading posts, a handful of cities. That their presence did not go much beyond that, though there were substantial links, trading links, recruitment centers for their mercenary armies. It was Hannibal that actually made it more than what it had been, and brought the wealth of the various silver mines into Carthaginian coffers. I believe that the relatively unpacified nature of Spain, though, can be seen relatively clearly highlighted in the fact that when Scipio, younger Scipio, enters Spain, takes command, he's there in 209 BC. There are 3 Carthaginian armies in Spain under 3 separate commanders, Hasdrubal Gisgo, Hasdrubal Barca, and Mago Barca. But they're widely separated. That is, there's one that is far 10 days march, I think, from New Carthage, while Mago and Hasdrubal Gisgo are both in what is now modern Portugal. And they're essentially they're fighting Spanish tribes who are not friendly to the Carthaginians. And I think that if there's one criticism that can be made of Hannibal's war of vengeance that seems that he fought against the Romans, is that he fought it too soon. That is, Carthage, had it been Spain, had it been allowed to be turned into a more thoroughly pacified region, a true province of Spain, you would have had all of the wealth and recruitment that you could possibly want. And Rome would not have found as much fertile ground to recruit anti-Carthaginian tribal chieftains to its cause. That's one of
the shame points that we don't have those details, because when you look at it, the Carthaginians, they're certainly not fighting a hearts and minds campaign in Spain. They seem to be really getting the whole Spanish peninsula against them in heart and soul. If you look at, there's a couple of references, I think it's Livy who describes that Hannibal attacking one city in Spain, which ends up holding out under siege to him, and eventually committing mass murder of their own troops in order to not give in to him. They are desperate to hold out against the Carthaginians, and whether they could have actually produced a pacified state, I would say that's it would be it's one of those things that we'd like to get hold of some of those Carthaginian sources that maybe Polybius and whatnot were looking at some stage, and see what they actually said about what they were doing in there, because they weren't winning them.
I think also the propensity for Spanish tribes to rebel doesn't go away for a long time. You've still got Spanish rebellions and Spanish being convinced to rebel against Rome for centuries.
All the way to 19 BC, in fact. Long time.
So there's
arguably a century longer, because
arguably till last week.
No, but the Romans maintained a 3-legion garrison there for almost a century after 19 BC. So that's not for fun.
But I think it's also a rich vein of recruitment.
Spain caused them a problem, really, because everywhere else they go, there is a pre-existing state of some sort that they can reorganize into their own creature. In Spain, you haven't got that pre-existing overriding identity or a pre-existing structure of any sort. So they really are struggling to actually impose that. And Carthage picks up the ball in that one. Rome carries it on, and they cannot unify it necessarily. They are continually dealing with individual tribes.
Yeah, so the Rome takes over those cities in the beginning and then builds up from there, and very slowly. So what do we know why the Romans kept going after they'd taken those? Basically, after the Second Punic War, Carthage is away out of Spain. But why did the Romans then go to the enormous effort that turns into centuries to conquer the whole peninsula?
I don't think the Romans ever wanted to take a step back. I don't think it was in their nature. I think, though, that the Spanish wars that they fought in the 2nd century BC were not popular because there wasn't much loot for legionaries to bring home, but they kept fighting them.
Well, I don't know. I wonder, because if you Las Medulas, for example, which is this enormous gold mine complex, I mean, you were talking about talents of silver, but it became a major industrial zone when, in fact, it had been pacified. So maybe it didn't have ready to steal and import back to Rome loot. It had to be processed and a great effort, but it proved to be very, very lucrative.
I think it's also lucrative in recruitment terms and training. There's generations of Roman generals who go and fight campaigns in Spain, who that's their proving ground and their testing ground, because there'll always be battles to fight. There'll always be tribes to pacify in Spain, or further pacify, and the number of Spanish recruits, the fact that Spain becomes Romanized, it later even provides emperors and things like that, but also Balearic slingers who become synonymous with slinging, that strange aspect of various parts of the ancient world that become associated with a particular weapon type, which is such an interesting aspect to recruitment. Why is it the Balearic Islands produce slingers and nothing else? Why is it that Crete supposedly produces archers and nothing else? Roads.
We can talk for a couple hours about whether Cretan archers are only archers.
But it was also somewhat regional, though. So, for example, the tribes of the Cantabri, for example, were apparently very, very good horse riders. So, yes, the Baleares may have produced stone slingers, but the north of Spain produced very good horse riders. So, I guess it comes down to geography at some point. But of course, the other thing is also Roman armor was benefited by having, for example, the gladius hispaniensis. as a key thing. So they obviously went to Spain, and they came back with a lot of experience, insight, and even tactical benefits.
But it is interesting to pick up from Murray. Is it a Roman tendency or an ancient tendency to sort of try and stick some kind of specialization? Because we can keep going. I mean, we talked about the Batavians before we started. They have a certain reputation for being good at amphibious warfare. Thessalians, the horsemen, the Spartans, the ultimate infantryman.
I think it's funny because I think the Roman system, as we understand it, is not meant to be this. The polyglot army where they fight in their own style is that's the Persian army of the 5th century BC and beyond. But that idea that you would keep a unit from a particular region fighting in a particular way in the Roman army almost contradicts the idea that the Roman army itself is meant to be malleable and able to adapt itself to these tasks. So the fact that there are these groups from tribal regions and geographic areas who undertake and become known for particular tasks.
But that sort of, you can prove against that when you sort of look at the Romans going to Spain, because the Romans going to Spain, all of a sudden they are learning to be a little bit more malleable in terms of how they're using their legionaries. You've got Cato when he decides to use his legionaries for more skirmishing tasks and for actually answering the guerrilla warfare. So actually it is not just a proving ground, but it is changing Roman tactics by actually taking on people in the Iberian Peninsula who are not conforming to your normal ideas of set-piece warfare that they are encountering elsewhere in the ancient world. So it's helping to develop the Roman army in that way.
But they're also going to be auxiliary units rather than the citizen legion units. I mean, the legion, I think, depending on the period you're talking about, does fit that model, Murray, where it's sort of homogenized and sort of consistent in its approach to things. And I think it's the Romans realizing the limitations, that they need to augment that very organization with these specialties. And we discussed this in a previous podcast about auxiliary units. The Spanish produce certain kinds of troops which are very useful, and they move them to other geographies as they do from Syria or wherever, pick country. But I think that goes to the strength of the military mind of the Romans, in a sense, is that they understand there's a limitation to what they are good at, but they will augment that with other skills.
But it is interesting to consider, as Mark said, you have the Romans who are fighting in Spain. I don't know if anybody's ever charted how many of those officers, probably especially, who fought in Spain, then got to fight in Greece.
Are you talking about...
in the 2nd century.
Oh, okay.
There must have been...
Right.
You'd think that there would have been soldiers who fought Spanish warriors in Spain, and in complete contrast with what they fought in Greece, with the same army.
A little early in the period, I'm certain that the Scipio's Spanish and African veterans were recruited to fight in the wars in Greece, 197, Canos Cephali, as well as Magnesia. So in the early 2nd century BC, they were being especially sought after because of their experience of veteran status. They were well-known, steady troops. It would stand to reason that probably Roman soldiers that had experience fighting in Spain were then used in various conflicts, say in Corinth or wherever.
And I think further to Mark McCaffery's point, it's also the fact that the officers who have had experience in Spain through their various experiences of fighting different types of enemies, they also get marked out for they will be a good commander in the future. There's an anecdote in Valerius Maximus only, for some reason, about Marius in Numantia, and he's identified by Scipio Aemilianus as being he's going to be a future great officer because of his experience here. And then again, from our knowledge from Sallust, Marius launches his own career when he's fighting in North Africa to be the ideal general because of his experiences as a new man fighting in Spain and elsewhere. So I think
as it happens against Jugurtha as well, who's done the exactly same thing, but from a Numidian perspective.
Exactly. So there's that idea that experience of being able to command and be flexible and use the legion in these ways, which is interesting because that's the whole idea of what the Roman legion can be, and then to augment it, as you were talking about, Lindsay, with troop types that we realise that our flexible Roman legions can't flex that far. Is kind of an interesting sort of system that they have, that the Roman legionary is this malleable, flexible force that can fight different types of warfare, provided the commanders remain flexible and malleable in their thinking.
And the brilliance is also the fact that they will be brought in sometimes as treaty allies or as a pacified people. So part of their submission, in fact, is to provide those troops. So, in fact, I guess the brilliance of it is to recognize and also to get it economically.
The Romans had pretty much given up on the light velite troops that they had as skirmishers, and I think that they pretty much oriented all of their citizen legionaries to fight as heavy infantry. Now, this also meant that the battlefield role of light skirmishing troop had to be filled by somebody. And it would seem to be that that's where auxiliaries from non-Roman regions, especially outside of Italy, came to the fore. That is, someone was going to have to be a light troop. Maybe it was the slinger from the Balearic Isles or wherever.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, though, that there are some geographic regions that become allied to provide X, but there are others that become, they are part of a Roman province. They are presumably a recruitment ground for heavy infantry, but they become, no, you do this thing. And I wonder whether, Balearic slingers, they're not from the Balearic Islands. They're just trained in that way and taken in to be that kind of troop.
You mean it became a troop type as opposed to an expression of geographical origin?
I wonder whether it is. Just
as with Cretan archers, maybe.
Cretan archers, Agrigonians under Alexander, you've got Thracian peltasts, you've got even Tarentine.
Well, for the peltasts, we know that becomes a troop type very quickly.
Exactly. So I wonder whether that could be extended to these others.
Peltasts. But there are still that's a whole different discussion and would require a lot of demographic research. But it's, for instance, well known that there's a lot of Bessi, which are Thracians, mountain people, in the classes Misenenses, because that makes sense. Mountain people, stick them on a ship.
Yeah, look, I think it's a fascinating proving ground. But again, the readiness of Spanish tribes to rebel and to ally themselves with rebelling generals is such an interesting one, because they look like they are leaping at the opportunity to fight a lot. You look at the campaigns of Sertorius, and Sertorius becomes quite unusually a renowned great general, even when he's sort of the enemy. The anecdotes about how good a commander he was and how skilled, and it's quite a remarkable sort of admiration in a later age.
But at his core, he's still got the Roman legionaries, and for that reason, you can still identify with him from the Roman perspective. If he had gone totally native, on the other hand, that'd be a different story.
Well, but to compare him to Mark Antony, who's still got Roman legionaries, but he's gone totally native and totally Egyptian and totally barbarian. Whereas Sertorius...
Augustus just had better PR people.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he had Horace and Virgil. But I think the interesting thing there is Sertorius' reputation remains intact, whereas Mark Antony is supposedly the best general of his generation after Julius Caesar. And he doesn't really ever come up to that. He never fulfills that promise.
And let's not forget Viriatus also, the Lusitanian, who was very highly regarded and actually seemed to be quite a good strategist as well as a tactician. In fact, he was done in by his own people, if I remember, for exchange of funds. But I think somebody made the point that Augustus had better publicity department. Of course, the Romans are writing the history here. We don't know how many other great chieftains there may have been that just didn't kind of make it into Livy or didn't make it into some of the accounts that would have great generalship.
How much do we know about, we were talking about the tribes being eager to fight against the Romans. How much do we know about tribes people in Spain who were willing to help the Romans? Does any of those stand out? Or were there any Romans particularly good at
I can think of the two chieftains, Indibulus and Mandonius, who became allied to Scipio during the latter half of the Second Punic War. And as I recall, both Indibulus, or at least Indibulus, revolted once Scipio against the Romans in Spain, once Scipio himself had departed to take care of things in Sicily and Italy and Africa against Hannibal. And it would seem to be that the whatever friendship had existed between the various Spanish chieftains were between them and Scipio, not the Roman Republic, however you want to put that together.
It's a personal relationship.
Right, a personal relationship. And that also the willingness of Spanish chieftains to turn on whether it's the Carthaginians, such as Hamilcar Barca, the chieftain of the Oritani who did him in, or what was going on with the Romans in Spain years later. They did not want foreigners taking control of their country. That would be a way to view what they were doing, and that they allied with the Romans when the Romans had the upper hand to eject the Carthaginians, and then they fought against the Romans to try and eject the Romans. That would be the simplest way to look at that, which is also what would happen in Gaul later on, and it happened in Germany most successfully of all.
I think it's also, when you look at Britannia, when you look at Gaul, when you look at Germany, when you look at Spain, the local chieftains are continuing local politics by allying with Rome as an alliance to further their personal ambitions or their tribal ambitions and, settle old scores. Once those are done, they consider that, the alliance has run its course and is no longer useful. The Romans, meanwhile, have a different attitude of conquest and control and, permanency that I think those tribal groups never had.
So here's an example. There's a tribe in Spain called the Brigaicini. There's a name that we don't hear very often, who at one point would have been overwhelmed by the Romans, who signed treaties with the Romans, actually helped the Romans against the Astures, and the Astures actually thought of them as being traitors because they actually were able to forewarn Carisius and his people of an imminent attack. So for the reasons you've given, Murray, I think it comes down to they understand where the rewards are now, and they side with those, and then they back up. Now, of course, as we know so often, a lot of these so-called pacified tribes decide to have another go. And in fact, that the whole later part of the conquest of northern Spain is this constant. The Cantabria and the Astures are always thought to have been pacified, only to find that someone has another go, and then they rise up in rebellion. So they do seem to be a people, to take Mark's earlier point, that really take a chance. I mean, if they see it opening, they'll take it.
But there's also the emphasis of the personal relationships that comes back time and time again. You've got it with, going back to Scipio Africanus, he develops this cult over there they basically are wanting to refer to him as the king and make the alliance with him personally. You then later on get Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus moving in and developing these really strong personal relationships with the Spanish tribes, to the extent that when his son is in a defeated army later on, that they seek out to actually make a deal with him, never mind that he's not actually the guy in charge of the legion or anything. Again, and you continue on to Sertorius later on, who again, it's his personal charisma with these Spanish tribes, that when it's his own Roman men who do him in the end, the Romans struggle to actually maintain the alliances. I mean, on his side, his former Roman allies struggle to maintain those alliances that he had established because he is now gone.
So another aspect of warfare in Spain in the time, for example, of 26 BC I'm looking at here, is banditry. And we see a lot of that in a lot of the Mediterranean countries. But there's apparently a tribal robber called Corocota, another great name, who apparently flourished in Iberia and actually managed to anger Augustus, and actually Augustus offers 1 million sesterces so he can actually be captured. And apparently the man came of his own accord, and Augustus was quite impressed by this and actually made him rich and actually gave him the money. So, he was a kind of a Robin Hood rogue that Augustus was rather fond of, and actually made him richer for actually coming forward. But that's another dimension. I wonder, again, the geography tends to, because you've got that great mountain range in the north, and you've got the great plains and very diverse geographies, is that brigandage is an issue that is there. I mean, the hiatus sort of style of warfare was very much reflective of that running down from the hills, hit and run, and disappear again.
Spain itself at this time was not at all united. That is, we can talk about the Spanish, but I don't think that there is any sort of like even a proto-nationalist feeling. I think what it was is that each tribe was interested in having whether it's the Carthaginians gone or the Romans gone, that was the way that they thought about what was in their interest. There was at least 3 different types of people that are delineated in Spain in the 3rd century BC and afterward. There were the Iberians, who were essentially the original inhabitants, and then in the north there were Celtic peoples who had come in from what's now modern France, and there was a fusion of these two peoples. They're called the Celtiberians. So, and these were all very distinct peoples, at least in the eyes of the Romans who would write about them. And the various peoples of Spain. And the reason I bring this up is that each of them, they were not all the same people, and I don't think that this was some sort of nationalist uprising ever against whether it was the Carthaginians or the Romans. I think that most tribes would take their chance as they saw it, and make alliances with whether the Carthaginian or the Romans, or against them as they saw fit.
Not trying to harp on about the importance of the personality in these warfares, but taking Lindsay's idea about the geography, it comes to mind about Sertorius being the emphasis on how good a commander he is that he's able to work with these different populations present on the Iberian Peninsula, and he's able to say, right, the geography dictates that if I'm going to make a retreat, I'm going to have to disband my army at times to actually make an effective retreat without sustaining massive losses. And to do that, and to allow your army to dissipate into the hills and into the landscape, only to reform a couple of months later at a given point, says a lot about that importance of personality.
And I wonder, there's an element in the sense that what we understand as Spain, España, in a sense is a Roman creation, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the different maps of the ancient world that you see in lots of history books, they talk about nearer Spain and further Spain, and then Augustus rejigs some of the provincial borders, and then you get Baetica and various other kind of places, and Lusitania. So I just wonder, a lot what we are in a sense inheriting is a Roman perspective on these people, and in fact I would imagine it's way more complicated when you go down to the ground level. Linguistically, culturally, and your point, Mark, earlier about there being 3. I suspect there are way more, but in the Roman and the classical imagination, it was like Gaul is divided conveniently into 3 parts. Yeah, so Spain is divided into 3 parts. So is it just because any more than that they can't cope with?
Well, I think the personality thing that Mark's talking about is also interesting, because that, again, the imposed unity that Roman provinces give places doesn't suggest the idea that alliances are between personalities, which is, again, that sort of the tribal, personality-based, leader-based mentality that we see coming back again and again. Attila the Hun's personality-based empire is gone as soon as he dies. So it's not something, and there have been countless other examples throughout, later history.
It reminds me of a certain TV show that just ended.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. If Grey Worm says he can't be king, apparently he can't be king. So, I think that idea of I make an alliance with you, not with the state that you represent, again, is that this disconnection between the way that tribal communities operate in various Roman provinces and Rome's attitude that this representative, this consul, this proconsul represents us. No one's told these tribal groups that that's the case. We made an agreement with XYZ. And I think you also get that disconnection of we made an agreement with the emperor. Oh, yes, no, but that emperor died. He was assassinated. It's now a new emperor. He's got a different attitude, but he's still Rome, but you still got to do what he said. And that kind of confusion and where Rome wants to betray an agreement, Rome hasn't betrayed an agreement. Where a tribal leader hasn't made an agreement with you, they're betraying Rome. So that continues for a very long time in Roman politics.
So the question is, and maybe Lindsay can answer that, how does Augustus in the end manage to pacify Spain as far as that goes?
Well, by the time he gets to about, I forget, it's 27 BC kind of period when he's really, he leaves Rome in the hands of his deputies, and he goes off to fight the final campaign, which is basically in the north. The Asteres, the Cantabri, and the Gallici, I think they're called. It's a tough campaign. It takes about 2 years where he's involved. He actually falls sick. He has to go back to the coast, and he's ferried off back to Rome. And it then becomes a war where his deputies have to fight it. And it really takes from 26 all the way to 19, and ends up with Agrippa. And what's interesting, when Agrippa comes in on the scene, the legions are completely demoralized. He actually faces a mutiny. So it hints at the fact that things are not going well for the Romans. Every time they think they've dealt with the situation, very very quickly it unravels. They put in a provincial governor, a prefect up in the north, whose name is Carisius, who is a reasonably well-able commander. He's at least able to do the job, and then apparently gets a bit greedy and ruffles a few feathers amongst the tribal people, who then revolt again, and then is swapped out. And finally, with Agrippa, it comes to an end, and then the mass industrialization takes place. And as you said earlier, there are these 2 or 3 legions which are kept there permanently. So they're always on their watch. And it seems to be at that point, an urbanization, pacification digs in. I mean, you get those great aqueducts being built, the great big towns, and this sort of thing. So it does seem to be in the last few years that the conquest was completed.
So, but does it have anything to do with, can we take this talk about the cult of personality or the imperial personality and personal relationships? Can we take that into account when it comes to the pacification, or is it just in the end plain old force and garrisons and patrols and everything?
If you look at Publius Carisius, and there are actually coins minted in Leon, I think it is, Legio, where he's very proud. He actually has coins minted with piles of captured trophies, of shields and spears and all sorts of things to make the point, to reward his troops with. But he's a liability, and in fact he's smartly replaced. And I think at that point then the stamp of Augustus himself becomes the way that they rule it. So they try the rule through deputies, and it doesn't work very well. And then very quickly central authority is brought in. But I don't know that there's very much other than Augustus, and from his point on, any evidence of local personalities coming to the fore. And in fact, I think it's a deliberate policy decision not to encourage local personalities to come to the fore.
Could we perhaps say that it's, perhaps a matter of war fatigue that eventually wears down Spain by the time of Augustus? That, you've had so much happen in that 200-year period, whereby there's, the population must have been severely impacted there. And when you actually, after Augustus, the next time you see somebody rise to a position of individual influence, it is a Roman governor who is leading a rebellion in order to, step up against Nero. And then again, later on, it is a base for individuals seeking individual power from the Roman administration, but they seem to be gaining support from the Roman population there. Even going back to Sertorius uses local Roman population even in his time to as a base of support. So by the time of Augustus, maybe we're looking at the original Spanish population's really starting to be decimated.
Well, I don't know, because everything that I'm reading suggests this, is that the northern tribes were quite resilient, and they're very much given to, like I said, the sort of the cavalry warfare. They can fight very, very sophisticated campaigns that way. They're infantry as well, but they rely on the terrain very much. They live in the hills, and they use guile and skills that they learned through sort of guerrilla warfare. But what's interesting is that when Augustus leaves Rome in the middle 20s, and he decides he's going to finish the campaign in Spain, he takes a massive army. It's about 12 legions or something, and a couple of dozen auxiliary cohorts, and even has a naval contingent brought in from the western coast of Gaul. And the doctrine of Augustan warfare is effectively to bring overwhelming odds to bear on an opponent. And I think what that hints to me is that probably the campaigns up to that point had taken so long because they hadn't scaled up the warfare to the needed levels. Whereas Augustus, in order to get the mission done, he would bring those sorts of resources to bear. He did the same thing in Germany as well. And I think that it worked because he was able to bring those resources to bear. And then finally it came down to a good general in the form of Agrippa, but you're right. They were a tough opponent. There was a war fatigue, and ironically, by the time it got to Agrippa, it was the Roman army that was the one that was fatigued. It wasn't actually the Asteres and the Cantabri.
I have to agree that it was probably a sense of fatigue over long periods of time, since both with Spain, Gaul, and ultimately Britannia, there were periods of long resistance until finally the resistance came to an end, and it was not necessarily all at once, but the resistance did peter out as I think Romanization took hold, whether it was in Spain, Gaul, or Britain, and probably because the Romans were there to stay and were willing to devote the resources over many decades to hold on to these territories.
But I do wonder though, Mark, that sometimes the impression I have is that in the middle centuries, as you move towards the end of the Republic, is the unwillingness to apply the resources needed to get the job done. So a proconsul goes out and he wants to get this over and done within a year. He wants to get the glory pop back and get the kudos from that. And very quickly, all the things that are achieved are unraveled, and therefore another guy goes out the following year and tries to do the same thing, and it doesn't work. It does take all those hundreds of years simply because there wasn't an overarching, I think, strategy or campaign which would deploy the numbers of men in the places they needed to be in order to achieve overall victory.
The Senate had to do that, and of course we have some idea that there were garrisons, legionary garrisons in places that Romans had conquered, but they don't get the limelight because they're not doing anything. They're just keeping the peace in theory, and only when, and we don't know to what degree they were permanent and to what degree they were sufficiently supported, anything. And of course it takes until, as you very well know, Lindsay, when Augustus comes around, and then you get a standing army, and only then is it very formal. We're here. This legion will stay unless it's absolutely necessary to go take it somewhere else. But there'll be new recruits. It will be kept on the strength, and it's going to stay. And there's Abram actually asked the question: how commonly were watchtowers employed by Romans to keep an eye on a territory that they had under control? We know, of course, that there were watchtowers employed along the borders, but do we know of any watchtowers within the Roman Empire to?
The only ones I know of are in Switzerland. That there's some in the sort of the South Germany part of the territory, and they seem to be rather more in that sort of no man's land of not quite official border, sort of like they're forward lookouts to some degree. We hear of under sort of the time of Varus that you've got road stations with troops dotted around Germany, and they seem to be embedded within the local community. I don't know that they exist in the Iberian Peninsula. I don't know that that's where you'd find them. But what I do know is that there are a couple of astonishing places where there were siege works that have been excavated, and they show immense preparation in order to be able to bring down a stronghold like a hill fort.
Building upon Lindsay's earlier point, why did it take so long, for example, to pacify Spain or Gaul or Britain? I think a major difference may have been when it comes to the Roman style of war making is that if you send out an army for a limited duration, that's not going to cut it. That is, an army under a proconsul might defeat the king in the east, where you defeat the enemy army in one battle, and that ends the war. Whereas if you defeat the Spaniards or the Gauls or the Britons in one battle, that only affects the tribes who were involved, and that there were many other tribes still that remained to be defeated. So in that sense, I mean, perhaps the Romans had to learn that they had to be in it for a long time, and as Augustus did, bring overwhelming force to bear, to actually bring the end to these various campaigns.
Well, Augustus was very canny in that regard, because in fact that the powers that he had, in these 5 and 10 year periods, and ultimately where he had the imperium, which was supreme over every other general, gave him the time in which to operate those campaigns. And he could then deploy through his deputies, and he could switch them around as he needed. So you get this unique opportunity where one man can see the whole thing and guide the whole story through. And I guess that can only be possible under an autocracy.
It's interesting. I think further to your point, Lindsay, it's like that the Romans prior to Augustus knew about the importance of Spain and its propensity to rebel and the need to suppress it. So, when Caesar does his lightning march down Italy against Pompey flees to Greece rather than pursue Pompey to Greece immediately, which is like, surely that's the game you should do. Caesar then goes, no, now I'll make sure that I conquer Spain, and goes and campaigns in Spain before pursuing Pompey. So it's like they know that securing Spain, making sure that Spain is at least quiet whilst you're campaigning elsewhere, is an essential, and you can, support making sure that you secured your rear, making sure that, there's not going to be a rebellion behind you when you're campaigning elsewhere. But that's a remarkable sort of insight that Spain is important. But again, I think that the completed conquest of Spain is only going to be doable when you have massive resources to do so. I
wonder it's because that Pompey has a large concentration of forces in Spain. I think that's the only reason why he goes there.
And Caesar's got that background as well. He knows what the Spanish troops are like. How you've got the ghost of Sertorius. You've got his experience there. He knows what's going to happen if the Pompey and his sons get a foothold.
Yeah, I think it's an awareness of what Spain is capable of, and capable of housing, if you like. So it's a really interesting thing that the conquest takes so long. And I think it's also about the fact that it's unglamorous. It's Roman already, I'm going to go and campaign in Parthia and a new territory, not reconquer something that's already been conquered. So I think it's.
Well, I suspect that
losing it will look really bad, though.
Yeah, I suspect that in the case of Augustus, he was looking at places to win glory. Having achieved his sort of settlement with the Senate, he's able to say, what's an easy target? Well, Britain's over in the north. I'll get to that eventually. Gaul seems to be okay. I'll finish the Spanish conquest. That's finished. He can then draw down troops and then move them into Germany. So that I would imagine is part of the logic there.
Maybe we should leave it at that. And maybe in 7 years we can discuss the conquest of Spain again. For those of you who listened to our first episode about the conquest of Spain, perhaps you can compare. Let us know which one was better. If you'd like to support the show, leave a review, or check out the magazine via ancient-warfare.com, or support Angus and the team on Patreon. Look for Ancient Warfare Podcast. See you in another month.